Welcome to Prepared for Parenthood, the podcast for hopeful, expectant, and new parents with little ones up to age 5. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Duger, a psychotherapist, author, educator, parent coach, and married mother of 2. On this show, we'll discuss everything from the most up-to-date practicals of best supporting your young children, to thriving in relationship as a family, to more surprising topics around the psychology and development of babies from conception through age 5. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm thrilled to have you here today. Hey everyone, welcome back to Prepared for Parenthood. Today I have Jennifer House, who's a registered dietitian, the mother of 3, the author of the Parents-Led Guide to Baby-Led Weaning, and the founder of First Step Nutrition in Alberta, Canada. She specializes in baby-led weaning and picky eating, and she believes raising happy, well-nourished eaters doesn't have to be a battle, which is so great to hear, Jen. I know people are going to be super excited about just hearing how to not do that, how to have an easy experience with baby-led weaning and starting solids and all of that. I know for me personally, it was a little tricky with my 2. They weren't so happy about transitioning right off the bat. So any information you can provide for our listeners today, I think is going to be a positive thing.
Thank you for having me. Is a lot of stress and anxiety, I think, around that time, especially if it's your first baby, you've never done this, introducing solids. There's a lot of fear and uncertainty. And of course, how we feed our kids from baby to toddler to children, it can really affect their whole relationship with food for the rest of their life. So there's a lot we can do to make that a positive relationship.
Yeah. And can you share a little bit about, you have 3 children. Was it difficult for you? Is that why you went into it? Or is it more because you came in from the dietitian side? How did you end up doing this work?
So before I had my first child, who's now 17, which is crazy, I did work in pediatric nutrition as well. And then I just wanted something more flexible. So I went into private practice. But with my first son, we started him on solids. It was infant rice cereal, kind of the standard recommendation at that time. And then kid number 2, my daughter, I think I made a baby bison puree for her because I know the importance of iron when starting solids. So I decided to try something other than the cereal. And I made a puree for her and she refused. All purees, she wouldn't touch them. I remember going to Mexico to an all-inclusive when she, shortly after 6 months, and sitting in the room trying to feed her purees, refused them. But we were at the buffet sitting around the table and she'd just want what was on our plate, right? Like the buns, the fruit. So she was my introduction into baby-led weaning, which is basically skipping the purees and baby self-feeds from the start. And at that time, it wasn't really a thing. It wasn't popular. I don't feel like I did a good job of translating my nutrition knowledge to how to do that in a healthy way. So she ended up with iron deficiency, unfortunately. And then my third came along. And by that time, you don't have time with 3 kids to sit there and feed them purees anyway. So he's a mix of anything, kind of whatever he wanted. And yeah, so just that story with my daughter, I feel like in terms of focusing on baby-led weaning in particular, there are lots of benefits. It's a great method to start solids. So I'm happy to help parents no matter how they choose to start solids. But I think there's a lot of mistakes that parents can make with it, like I did myself. So I just want to support parents in making sure that they do it in a way that's both, fun, easy, but also healthy for their children.
And what are some of the big mistakes that parents make around that?
Well, one of the big mistakes one I made myself is not focusing on iron-rich foods. I think it's a little more overwhelming when you're thinking about how to get the iron foods into your baby in terms of finger foods, as opposed to spoon feeding them the infant cereal, for example. That is definitely one. Lots of parents will just feed like fruits and veggies or easy foods, and they don't really realize that food before 1 is just for fun. Is not just for fun, right? You hear that a lot. Food before 1 is just for fun. And it should be fun, but there's so much that babies need starting around 6 months in terms of sensory exploration, oral motor, practice chewing, moving that food around in their mouth, Introducing allergens around that age is great to prevent them. And then the nutrition and primarily iron, because around 6 months, most babies have depleted stores from, they grow their iron stores when they're in your tummy, mostly third trimester. So it depends on a number of factors, like if you're able to do delayed cord clamping, if you carry them to term versus preterm. But most babies around 6 months start to need extra sources of iron from their food.
And what kind of challenges show up if a baby is iron deficient?
If a baby's iron deficient, you might notice that they are pale, they tend to have a poor appetite. So then that can be a poor cycle because they don't grow well. So poor appetite, poor growth. If they get sick a lot, so if they have poor immunity. With my daughter, I actually noticed she was 4 by the time I realized she had low iron and took her for her first blood test, but she had really thin hair. It was falling out quite easily and she hadn't been growing well. And it can progress to learning challenges, learning difficulties. And unfortunately, some of that is irreversible. So in her case, she is average height, if that, and the rest of her family, including me, my husband, and brothers, are off the charts in height. So perhaps her physical growth was stunted in those first few years of life. So those are some of the signs to look for. And I know the American Academy of Pediatrics does recommend iron screening at 12 months, which I think can be a good idea just to make sure you're on the right track.
And it is possible also to get too much iron, right? It can be toxic when it's too much.
Yeah.
I only know this information because I have a 16-year-old and an 11-year-old right now. And our 11-year-old was having trouble sleeping. And our pediatrician said, let's check for iron, which I didn't realize was related to sleep. I don't know if that's also true for babies that age, but it was impacting her sleep a lot. And so we had to boost her iron. Both my children eat vegetarian by their own choice. And so boosting their iron was a big deal. And after increasing the iron appropriately, she's sleeping a little better. So that's positive. So I'm wondering also if it might be tied to baby sleep, which is often a thing that I see in my practice of babies not sleeping as well as parents would hope that they would be at that age.
Yeah, you're right. I think that could be possible. And I also appreciate your point in that too much iron can also be toxic. That's why I usually recommend testing your child before blanket supplementing. I mean, trying to increase through diet, regardless, is safe and fine because you can't get too much iron that way. But if you're going the supplementation route, which you generally need if your child's blood levels are low to get it back up, but we don't want to blanket do that because it's not great. First of all, it probably lead to constipation right away, but there are other dangers too.
So, what are some good foods that contain iron that would be easy to introduce to a child?
If you're not a vegetarian family, the iron in meat is absorbed at about twice the rate as iron in vegetarian sources. So the vegetarian sources would be the beans, lentils, the fortified infant cereals, and then the heme iron in meat. So I mentioned bison earlier is really high in iron. Beef, a dark chicken or poultry has more iron than the white poultry. And then you can also do things like cook in a cast iron pan to leach a little bit of iron into the food. Even cooking with like garlic and onion actually has a component in there that'll help increase the iron absorption. So that's great if you're making like a lentil stew or something. It probably has that garlic in there anyways. And also vitamin C. So I just encourage parents to offer a source of iron at each meal, a fruit or veggie, which will be your vitamin C. And then don't forget about fat too, because babies and kids do need more fat for brain growth than adults. But those are some sources of iron and ways to boost them.
And isn't it different for parents who are breastfeeding or chest feeding than it is for babies who are not nursing or not nursing anymore in terms of when solids get introduced? What's your experience around that?
Breast milk, of course, is always great for baby, contains a lot of those immunological factors, help keep them healthy, but it is very low in iron and it is very well absorbed. But even if your baby is full-time nursing, they're only getting maybe 0.5 milligram of iron per day. And at 6 months, they need, funny, the recommendations vary, but in North America, we recommend 11 milligrams which is actually based on vegetarian sources. So some other countries who consider maybe omnivore diets of babies would be like 7 to 8 milligrams. So breast milk doesn't have a lot of iron in it, though it is well absorbed. The fortified baby formula, of course, will be higher in iron, not as well absorbed as breast milk, but it does contain significantly more. So I wouldn't make different recommendations really in terms of starting solids. I think it's still important to start at around that 6 months of age and still focusing on the iron rich foods, fruit and vegetables, and fat.
And what tends to be a parent's biggest fear when they're introducing solids or when baby is reaching for solids for the first time?
I think it tends to be choking, especially when introducing those finger foods, whether you're doing purees or starting with finger foods. A lot of parents have real anxiety about their baby choking, which is fair, right? That could certainly be a scary situation to run into. And there has been a fair number of studies put out to show that babies who start solids with baby-led weaning, they actually don't choke more often than the babies who start with purees. So that's important to know. And it's also important to note the difference between gagging and choking, because I think that can get confused a lot. Whereas gagging, the baby goes red, they make that loud retching noise. It's a part of learning how to eat. It's just bringing the food back up to chew a little more, and it's actually preventative against choking. So gagging is okay. It's a good thing, and we don't have to freak out about it. Try and keep things relaxed. You don't want your baby to be scared about eating. But there are lots of things you can do to prevent choking as well in terms of serving food that's in a safe shape and a safe texture. So the texture would be soft if possible. So if it does happen to get past your baby's gag reflex, that they could bring it back up on their own, as opposed to a harder food that could get lodged in their windpipe. And then in terms of shape, we want to avoid things that are perfectly round. So classically, you'll hear avoid grapes, avoid hot dogs, because they're just that round shape. So I love to use like a mandolin if you have that to cut sweet potato, even like apples or a hard pear. And then you can steam those until they're soft. And then once the baby has that little pincher grasp where they can pick up smaller pieces around 8, 9, 10 months. For some of those harder foods, like a raw apple, for example, you could just take a cheese grater and use that to make little shreds that then they could pick up. And, they're such a small shape that they're not going to cause choking.
Great advice. It also, I think, helps to have a dog around at that time because I found
Yeah.
that most of the food ended up on the floor and there was a lot of cleanup involved, but not so much with a dog around.
Yeah. The dogs love it when babies start to eat, don't they?
Yeah. So how about people who have preemies and developmentally the child is behind, even though they might be 6 months, they might only be 4.5 months, maybe.
So
Should those parents wait longer?
that's a good question. So generally, those preemie babies, they might already be on iron supplementation, which is a good thing. And often when starting solids, the baby's not likely going to be physically ready until closer to 6 months adjusted age. So they might have to wait a little bit longer. We want baby to have enough strength in their neck and in their trunk, in their body, that they can lean forward and spit food out, which is important to prevent choking. And if they're self-feeding, that they can grasp and put it to their mouth. And some of that strength is required for safety and to prevent choking. It also indicates that their entire body is ready to start eating. But they don't necessarily have to be able to sit up on their own for a minute, for 2 minutes. If your baby has some strength and they can sit up in their high chair, even if you need a rolled up towel on their side, that could be okay too. I know a couple of my kids were really late sitters and walkers, and they weren't sitting on their own until 8 months. And I wouldn't have felt comfortable like waiting that long to start them on solids. So it's baby dependent, of course, individual, but generally around 6 months. And I would say adjusted usually for the premature babies.
Are there certain foods other than the shapes and textures? Are there certain foods that you would say don't introduce early on? Or is it kind of whatever baby is drawn to?
Yeah, I do get a lot of those questions, specifically in related to allergies. Like, do we need to avoid peanuts or egg whites, for example? And that used to be the recommendation years ago, right? Avoid peanuts until 3 years, egg whites until a year, egg yolks until 9 months. But what we know now is that delaying actually increases the rates of allergy. And we know now that introducing those allergens earlier, so in that first year, shortly after you start solids, so early and often can actually promote tolerance and prevent allergies. So it's okay to introduce the high risk allergens, which would be like peanuts, tree nuts, wheat, fish, shellfish, soy, dairy, after you start solids. And you don't really need to avoid anything other than honey containing products because that can contain botulism, foodborne illness, and anything else that could cause foodborne illness because babies a little more susceptible to that. So like sushi, right? Undercooked meat. And of course, anything that's super high in sugar or salt. We try and keep babies' diet a little lower in salt too, just because they have developing kidneys. But that's about it. I know most foods are good to go. Even a lot of family foods can be modified. If it's a family dish that's too salty, I'd just like rinse it in a strainer under the water to maybe get rid of some of that extra salt. But yeah, babies can have almost everything that we can.
And then with the allergies, is that true even if there are a lot of allergies in a certain family? So say both parents are allergic to shellfish or something.
Yeah.
I imagine they wouldn't want to handle shrimp, but in terms of introducing it to their child, is there a higher likelihood that the child might actually not end up with an allergy if the allergen is introduced early, even if both parents have a lot of allergies?
Yeah, I think that's true. And if you have access to an allergist, I think it can be great to get baby tested if they're higher risks for allergies. So if you know they have allergies or parents or siblings have allergies, but there are some newer guidelines coming out to suggest for babies who are at high risk, it might be beneficial to introduce those high risk allergens or like not before 4 months. You don't want to start solids before 4 months, but between 4 to 6 months. So earlier, they're actually pushing maybe introducing these even earlier for babies who are at high risk. But your doctor or pediatrician or allergist could make those recommendations for you.
Amazing. It's so different than when my kids were very little. The recommendations have changed a lot. So,
Yes.
anything else that might be helpful for parents to hear or know about today?
I know that we've been talking about all of these things to do, and it can be stressful and lots of things to remember. And we did mention food before. One is not just for fun, but I think big part of this is you do want to keep some fun in it, right? It's a fun time for both mom and baby, and sit down and eat with your baby. They learn so much from watching you, modeling how you're eating. They learn how to eat and you're serving as a good role model. And when kids get to the age that our children are now, there's so many benefits to family meals. And I think that's a great thing to start from 6 months or whenever your baby starts eating. Or even if they're not ready yet, you can sit the 5-month-old at the table and they can watch you and chew on a carrot or something, a little hard munchable to help practice. But just exposing them to those family meals and family foods from the start, there's lots of benefit.
Thank you so much, Jen. How can people get in touch with you and find out more about what you're doing and what you offer?
My website is firststepnutrition.com, and I have a tab of freebies there, and I have a free webinar on baby-led weaning, and you can find out all my services there, and I have a blog there too. And if you have any questions about starting your baby on solids, I've probably written a blog on it.
That's so great. Thank you so much for being here, Jen. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for listening to the Prepared for Parenthood podcast today. I hope you found this episode educational, informational, and conversational, and that you'll join me again for another episode soon. If you enjoyed listening to today's podcast, I'd very much appreciate if you would review and subscribe. If you're interested in more information related to today's podcast or are looking for parent coaching or courses, you can find my information in the show notes or online at preparedforparenthood.com.